Welcome to this briefing from the Global Security Forum here in the National Liberal Club. Our forum today is entitled Troubling Times for India. Diminishing Democracy, question mark, Kashmir Conflict, not a question mark, and the effect of Afghanistan, also not a question mark. That's what we're looking at today. My name is Michael Clarke. I'm an advisory board member of GSF, and I'm very happy to chair this event. It is a hybrid event, so we have people here with us in the National Liberal Club, and then we have many more out there in cyberspace. So we're trying to go and try to make both formats work as well as they can today. When it comes to Q&A, question and answer, we will take questions from our audience here, but also if you want to ask a question, then please put it into the usual Q&A format on your browsers, and we will try and deliver it. If we can get to you to actually deliver your question in person on your own camera, we will. If we can't, we will make sure your question is put. And if you would like us to put your question, if you'd prefer not to put it yourself, just put read in front or behind the question, and we'll try to deliver it in that way. So let's get straight on. We've got until 2:15. We're looking at troubling times for India. It's interesting that geopolitically, the great wheels of geopolitics have been turning quite rapidly in recent years. And I always say that the big four in the world are now making the weather for the rest of us. And the big four, of course, are the United States and China and Russia for different reasons, and India. And as those geopolitical wheels turn, so the world is turning quite quickly with them. And that matters a great deal to us in Europe, and particularly to us in Britain, as we embark on Brexit Britain, on our global security and our global Britain future. I'm always struck by the fact that the ethnic minority, the Indian communities in Britain, are the biggest of our ethnic communities, also the richest, and our intercommunal relations are extremely good. We have great intercommunal relations between India and India, India in Britain, Britain in Britain, and Britain in India. Our political relations are a bit less good. From Britain's point of view, it's a bit like treading on eggshells, partly because of the past and partly because of a lot of legacy issues. But one hopes that that may change. And in light of what is happening in the world, I suspect that it might. So we have four panelists today looking at different aspects of this troubling times for India. And I'm delighted to introduce our first panelist, who is Professor Mukulika Banerjee. She's going to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes, 7 minutes. She is the inaugural director of the London School of Economics Centre for South Asian Studies from 2015 to 2020. She's also the author of this new book, which you won't see yet, but you will see soon. It's got a very clever title. It's called Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Rural India. Most of us in Britain think only about it in terms of urban India, but this is politics and democracy in rural India. And so she is exactly the right person to get us started on some conceptions of the troubling times for India. Professor Banerjee.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you for this opportunity to think a little bit about what's happening in India and its democratic credentials. And I speak as much as a social scientist who has studied democracy and elections in India and elsewhere for over 2 decades. But I'm also an Indian citizen who's lived in the UK for over 3 decades. So I'm particularly invested in seeing strong ties between the UK and India, and in India being taken seriously and with respect. It is therefore concerning that while India is widely known as the world's largest democracy, which it is, its credentials on that front are increasingly challenged. The 2018 report released by the Varieties of Democracy Institute described India as an electoral democracy and not as a liberal democracy because of an autocratization process that found expression in a partial closing of the space for civil society, in quotes, their words, including NGOs and the media, and in a decline of political transparency. India's democracy was therefore characterized as electoral authoritarianism, which basically means the veneer of elections is used to conceal the erosion of rights and freedoms. And even the electoral system itself, that was rightly celebrated as a marvel, indeed I and others wrote books about this, this electoral system has been systematically corrupted in various ways. Electoral funding has been made opaque, the secrecy of the ballot has been compromised, and the independence of the Election Commission has been violated. And I'm happy to take questions on any of these afterwards. I know they're big claims. The 2019 Democracy Index of the Economist Intelligence Unit showed that India had slipped 10 places in 2019 in global rankings to 51st place, behind South Africa, Malaysia, Colombia, Argentina. And so as part of this, India is now part of what are called flawed democracies because of an erosion of civil liberties. It's therefore evident that by academic standards, India's democratic credentials are sliding. And the caveat here to note, of course, is that democratic credentials are sliding in many countries, including the one that we are living in the US and elsewhere. So this is not an isolated phenomenon, but the scale of the problem in India, and especially its implications for, as you said, the big four, are serious, and we need to know what is going on, at least, to think about it. Now, today, in a piece in the Indian Express, the political scientist Ashutosh Varshney has called this the ideology behind this democratic backsliding, Jim Crow Hindutva. For just like the black population in the US, the Muslims of India today have been dehumanized, segregated, and made vulnerable to public lynchings and increasingly disenfranchised. As Varshney puts it, quote, what race was to the American South, ethnicized religion is to Hindu nationalists. Consider, he says, how legislative control has been used in India after May 2019, amended public safety laws, give the government the power to designate any individual as a terrorist or anti-national, imposing preventive detention with uncertain access to courts, and Article 370 and so on that have been imposed, and we can talk about them. I'm sure others will raise it, especially in the context of Kashmir. So India's democracy is in peril, and it would be wise to remember, therefore, what Levitsky and Ziblatt in their book, How Democracies Die, warn. Their prognosis is that democracies very rarely die by sudden violent coups. They die slowly, and they die by being hollowed out and through the degeneration of democratic cultures. So what is required, therefore, is constant vigilance by citizens. But the two traditional sectors that we would expect would maintain vigilance are the media and academia. The media, as we know, in India has been severely stymied. India's press freedom index is now at 142, a fall of 20 places in 10 years. And academic freedom, as a recent report has shown, is under severe threat. And again, I can elaborate if anyone wants to hear how. Even more worryingly, while these traditional guardians of vigilance of the excesses of government have been curtailed, what we have in place is its very opposite, namely vigilantism. Thus, vigilantism has replaced vigilance. Vigilance stands for active citizenship, civic engagement by citizens, preserving the space for dialogue, disagreement, and compromise, taking one's citizens' duties seriously, not just by voting in elections, but by holding those elected to account in between elections. It is respecting institutions and the rule of law and constitutional values. It is civil and patient and works for a common good. Vigilance needs careful cultivation. Vigilantism, on the other hand, takes matter into one's own hands. It is shrill and relies on the strength of numbers. Vigilante groups target, harass, lynch, and seek to defy norms of civility. On any week in India, and practically on any day, evidence of such vigilantism is to be found. Social media campaigns against the biggest brands in India like Tata, or the Indian cricket captain Virat Kohli, or the biggest Indian movie star Shah Rukh Khan, And today, in today's news of the well-known brand Fab India, are widely known. Perhaps less known are the constant microaggressions that such high-octane campaigns legitimize, such as last week's vigilante groups of citizens in Gurgaon, just outside Delhi, that refused to let a group of Muslims pray for their 5-day prayers in a clearing, even though they were disrupting nothing. Vigilantism, in contrast to vigilance, is anti-democratic in culture. Thus, as an observer, what is of concern is that while the repair of institutions of democracy is still imaginable, the restoration of civility and tolerance, the absolute hallmarks of democratic cultures, is less so. And unlike the US, where Jim Crow laws were practiced, India exists cheek by jowl with neighbors where Hindus are in a minority. As this week's events in Bangladesh show, the adoption of Jim Crow policies towards their minorities, who are Hindus in Bangladesh, might prove to be a challenge that Hindutva will struggle to contain. Thank you.
Mukulika, thank you very much indeed. It's a very sobering picture that you present us, and your plea for civility and tolerance is something that we've been talking a lot about in this country in the last week for not dissimilar reasons, I think. So let's move on to our second speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Sumantra Bose. He also of the LSE. He has been a lifelong student of comparative politics. He may think that when he comes to events like this, he's getting away from his students, but I think he finds he's actually with quite a lot of his students when he's here one way or another. He is the foremost analyst on Kashmir. He has just produced his new book, Kashmir at the Crossroads, Inside a 21st Century Conflict. And that comes on top of very distinguished work that he's done on contested lands, looking at different cases of contestation, not dissimilar to Kashmir, and on religious and secular societies. And I should also say that this is a Yale University book, and you can get a 30% discount on it by using the code YKASH, YCASH. So Yale Kashmir, YCASH. That code is available at the Yale website, but it'll also be on the GSF website. So if you want to have a look at the book afterwards, get it for 30% off, and I'm sure it'll be very well worthwhile. Sumantra, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Clarke. I recall that the last time we met was at the Aspen Global Security Forum at Lancaster House 5 years ago. It's lovely to see you again. And thank you, GSF, for inviting me here today. This is incidentally the first time I've seen and laid hands on this new book because the delivery of my advanced copies have been somewhat delayed, maybe due to the lorry driver issues, I don't know. I suspect that may be the case. My remit in the discussion today is, I think, the Kashmir conflict and its current state. So let me start out by saying that all three regions of the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, which was abolished, its statehood was abolished and it was divided into two union territories almost exactly 2 years ago, that all three regions of that former state are in a disturbed and unstable condition as we speak. And the portents are really not good. Let's talk about the Jammu region first, which is often overlooked or forgotten or neglected because of the common preoccupation, especially in mass media, with the Kashmir Valley. For over a week now, the arterial road running from the city of Jammu to the town of Poonch along the line of control between the Indian and Pakistani Kashmirs has been disrupted due to counter-insurgency operations. And at last count, until yesterday, at least 9 Indian Army personnel had been killed, including 2 officers, in fighting with militants, with no known militant or insurgent casualties so far. The fighting began in the Surankot area, or Tehsil. It's an administrative subdivision of a district of the Poonch district on the Indian side, and has spread to another Tehsil called Mendhar of the Poonch district, and Thana Mandi, which is in the neighboring Rajouri district just to the south. And those names, Surankot, Mendhar, Thana Mandi, brought back some bad memories for me, because I remember being in that area a few times, about 20 years ago, when it was truly frightening to be there. Even worse than the Kashmir Valley in some ways, with intense fighting between hundreds of mostly Pakistani militants and the Indian army. So it's almost as if we are going back in time to the bad old days. The Kashmir Valley gets much more coverage in the media, and rightly so. Well, what's been going on there in October, in the last week to 2 weeks? There has been a sharp escalation in targeted killings, particularly in the capital city, Srinagar, of non-Muslim civilians, a Kashmiri Pandit chemist, a Sikh high school principal who was a woman, and so on. As a result, perhaps in retaliation, there has been a fresh wave of hundreds of arrests of a variety of suspects. Let me give you an idea of what it's like to be a civilian belonging to a minority community, a Hindu or a Sikh in the Kashmir Valley as we speak. The remnant Kashmiri Pandits of Srinagar and elsewhere in the Kashmir Valley, several thousand people, not a very small number, have largely been moved from their residences and put either in hotels in Srinagar or in security force bases, the nearest police stations and paramilitary camps and army bases. And the shootings have also targeted non-locals, i.e. people from elsewhere in India, like street vendors and construction laborers, who have been, several of whom have been fatally shot in the last week or so. And those people are also being concentrated in high security sites. So that's a glimpse of the precarious security situation in the Kashmir Valley. Finally, the Ladakh region, a vast high-altitude desert that spreads east of the Kashmir Valley to the borders of Tibet. And of course, we have strategic experts and analysts here. All of us know about the, well, one might call it the new front of the Kashmir conflict that has been active since at least the summer of 20, if not the autumn of 2019, on Ladakh's border with Aksai Chin and Western Tibet. Suffice it to say in these brief opening remarks that about a week ago, the tortuous talks, high-level military-to-military talks between the Indian and Chinese armies broke down in failure, and the Chinese described the Indian position on disengagement from flashpoints along the line of actual control as it's known, as the Chinese described the Indian position as, quote-unquote, unrealistic and unreasonable. Quite dismissive, of course. Okay. Well, India's democracy has been on a slippery slope towards open authoritarianism since the first Modi government took office in May 2014. I've called it the slippery slope in this book. I've also used the term authoritarian creep. But it's since the inauguration of the second Modi government, which is effectively a duopoly, Modi and his extremely powerful Home Minister Amit Shah, it is since the inauguration of that second Modi government that Indian democracy has been in free fall, not on a slippery slope anymore, but in free fall towards outright authoritarianism. Let me just wind up by making 2 points. First of all, the Kashmir conflict has more or less been the cause of 4 wars between India and Pakistan in the last 7 or so decades, counting the Kargil War of 1999. There was almost another 5th war in 2002. This is a perennially flammable conflict, a very, very delicate situation that should be dealt with very carefully by those in positions of responsibility and political authority. Instead, what was done by the present government in New Delhi on 5th, 6th August 2019 resembled the behavior of an arsonist pouring loads of flammable fuel on a simmering fire. And my own hunch is that there would have been a major escalation. Of course, the China-India situation in Ladakh does count as a major escalation, but leaving that aside, I think there would have been other major escalations by now had it not been for the pandemic, which diverted attention elsewhere and suspended politics as normal, including very nasty politics as normal, as is the case in Kashmir. Well, my final remark, well, fear not, worry not. Just yesterday, the administration, it's not a government because it's unelected and is not accountable to anybody except Mr. Modi and his henchman, Mr. Shah, but the administration of the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, which includes both the Jammu region and the Kashmir Valley, signed a memorandum of understanding with the government of Dubai on real estate investments and industrialization in the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, in the Kashmir Valley in particular. This was signed in Srinagar yesterday. So we can look forward, I think, to Srinagar, which is an old city with a centuries-old history, rather charming even in its decrepitude, becoming a new Dubai in the near future. Something to look forward at least. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Sumantra. We'll hold that thought. As you say, we can't disentangle the problems of democracy with Kashmir, and as you say, we may be slipping into the bad old days in a situation where there are now greater geopolitical implications of the bad old days for the whole Kashmiri problem. Okay, let's move on now to Shashank Joshi. Shashank is the defense editor at The Economist. He has held positions in University of Cambridge and Harvard. Also, I'm very proud to say, at RUSI. And he's now a member of the advisory board at RUSI. He's also been involved in the Oxford University Changing Character of War program. The Economist doesn't name anybody. There are no bylines in The Economist. But you will notice, if you read their defense and quite a lot of their security material, that it's not only extremely well informed, but it's very cannily commented upon. And when you see that, although he doesn't get the byline for it, it's Shashank. He's a very distinguished and ever-growing presence, I think, in The Economist's stable of writers as the defense editor. So, Shashank, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, for those very kind words. And conversely, if you see something you violently disagree with or that's shoddy, it wasn't me. Just assume it was somebody else. Thank you for those extremely informative and useful set of reflections, just there, if a little bit grim and gloomy. I think it's worth beginning by reflecting on exactly what you said, Michael, the geopolitical ramifications of what Professor Bose called the bad old days, or the hints of a return to the bad old days. I think he went beyond hints. He called it free fall, and so on. I remember as a student reading your first book on Kashmir, Professor Bose, and at the time, sort of among others, and thinking back to that, it prompts me to ask what some of the key differences are between the conflict in those bad old days that stretched on for quite a long time. You could, from late 80s all the way to the early 2000s in one form or another, and the present day. And there are lots of differences to do with the, Indian demography, Indian society, the Indian political environment, the nature of militancy. But what stands out to me as an observer of this is how small the geopolitical ramifications are today compared to how substantial they seemed if you were looking at this from the vantage point of 1995 or 1996 or 2001, 2002, 20 years ago, when it loomed very much larger, and it was a question on the minds of ministers in this country, in Europe, in the United States. If there was a crisis, a US or British decision to withdraw nationals from India or Pakistan had major consequences. It was a big deal. I think one thing we have seen as a consequence of India's economic rise, its political self-confidence stemming from that rise, its geopolitical position, has been it has felt more immune to outside pressures. And I think the perception of the outside world, human rights concerns, more generally and specifically on Kashmir, including the revocation of Kashmir statehood and the associated developments, those caused far less of an international splash than they would have done in the 90s and the 2000s. And that has shaped the calculus of Indian governments. And of course, I look forward to disagreement on this if my panelists disagree. But I think it's also given rise to a sense of insulation. The Indian government has felt it has more latitude and autonomy to act as it sees fit, with an eye on domestic constituencies, domestic developments. And so, what a European minister thinks about human rights in Kashmir simply looms less large in the minds of any government in New Delhi today than it once did. And I think that's a major development. And we don't always notice it because it's a development that has occurred quite slowly over a long period of time. But if a crisis erupted today, and indeed we saw a crisis 2 years ago over Balakot, the Balakot crisis, when India conducted airstrikes against Pakistan, the position of outside actors was very different to how it was in the 2002 crisis, which was a huge mass mobilization of armies and a really substantial crisis. Outsiders had less leverage. Outsiders were less of an important factor on the Indian calculation as to how they would act. There was more sympathy and support for India than there would have been 20 years ago, including from European governments, including from the UK, which might have been more cautious in years past. I think that is a really important shift in India's position in the world. So in other words, the geopolitical implications of those developments in Kashmir have lessened. That's not a normative judgment on the importance of those developments. I share the assessments of my other fellow panelists and their cautionary approach to that and their warnings, and I share that assessment. I'm just commenting on what it all means. However, there is still a sense of concern and caution in India stemming from the geopolitical environment, and that's visible from wherever you look on India's northern frontiers. In Afghanistan, it goes without saying, the collapse of the government in Kabul, in which India had invested a great deal of diplomatic and development capital over 20 years, was a real blow. It was a substantial blow. And not only was it a blow, but the specific composition of the Afghan government that has emerged is a double blow, because it isn't just that the Taliban have emerged victorious, a force that Indian policymakers associate with the hijacking of an Indian Airlines flight in 1999 and the humiliation of their nationals and Pakistan's orchestration of events, but specifically, the Haqqani faction of the Taliban, the Haqqani network, a semi-autonomous group associated with the Taliban that provides its deputy leader, Sirajuddin Haqqani and many other important figures, has muscled out the political leadership in the Taliban quite handily. And we've seen figures like Mullah Baradar practically humiliated and sent packing from Kabul. So that is particularly bad news because the Haqqani network, as we know from long experience, is not just a powerful and more radical force within the Taliban, it's also one that has the most intimate associations with Al-Qaeda, and it's the one that has the most intimate, long-standing associations with the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence agency. So the Indian government is taking, from what I see, a very pragmatic approach to the government and are following the lead of other countries in engaging with the new regime to a limited extent in a cautious way. But the composition of this new government is about as bad as it could have got for the Indians. And of course, they don't need to be reminded that it was in Afghanistan that Lashkar-e-Taiba, the militant group, terrorist group responsible for the Mumbai attacks, found its feet in the 1980s, and in which it still has a presence. I think it doesn't mean there is a direct and immediate connection between events in Afghanistan and events in Kashmir. I think that's probably not the case, but I think there is a longer-term concern about the threats that will emanate from Afghanistan and the Indians' ability to protect their interests in that part of the world, not least because their traditional partners there, Russia and Iran, have quite decisively pivoted away and shifted sides, accommodating the new Taliban regime. China, we've heard a little bit about already. I think we've seen a decisive shift in India-China relations since 2017, going back even before the crisis over the Galwan Valley in Ladakh, going back to the crisis in 2017 over the tri-junction of India, Bhutan, and China. We can say more about that in detail if you like later on. But I think what we have seen since Galwan, since the violent clash last year, is a decisive and irreversible disillusionment in India in terms of the hopes they have in their ability to staunch China's shift away to a more hostile position, and I think that is now irreversible. The Galwan crisis may not be violently, openly erupting as it was when dozens of people were dying last year in terrible fashion for the first time in decades, but it is still a slow-burning crisis. The Chinese have not withdrawn from their positions. The area remains heavily militarized, and the Indians face a new and permanent front that is already causing a reallocation of resources away from Pakistan and towards China in a fundamental way, and we've seen open statements to that effect by the Indian government. I won't say any more on Pakistan, but we can return to that. I'm sure Rahul may say a little bit more about that. The final thing I'd like to say is just, amid all this gloom, I still think there is a sense of geopolitical optimism or a geopolitical advantage in India. And I think that's because the alignment of power in the Indo-Pacific, the term that's, of course, in fashion and increasingly used in India as it is in Japan, Australia, and other Asian countries, is moving in India's favor. In the last year, we have seen a resurgence of the Quad, India, the United States, Japan, and Australia, the first ever in-person Quads Leaders Summit, a raft of Quad initiatives, a vaccine initiative, amid other projects. This is emerging into a clear and valuable and useful diplomatic bloc of a kind that Indian governments would never have agreed to even 6 or 7 years ago, and that is largely a function of China's rise. And all of that is occurring as other minilaterals are bubbling up. India, Japan, Australia, India, Japan, France, at which India is playing a sort of pivotal and central role and is much courted and is much sought after among all of these parties. And I think that puts it in a relatively strong position, which somewhat offsets all of the other problems from the eroding security situation around it. I'll stop there if that's fine and hand over to Rahul.
Shashank, thank you very much. And our fourth speaker this morning is Rahul Roy Chowdhury. It's a great pleasure to see him again. Rahul and I worked together at King's College some years ago. For some time now, he's been a senior fellow in South Asian Studies at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Before that, he was working in the National Security Council within the Prime Minister's office in New Delhi. And he's also the author of a very good book on India's maritime strategy, and has also written on sea power, India's sea power destiny. He spends quite a lot of his time working on bilateral relations between India and Pakistan, and more latterly between the UK and India. So it's a great pleasure to get his perspectives on this, until recently, unrelievedly gloomy picture that we're painting for ourselves of India's future. Rahul.
Thank you very much, Mike. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to present anything that is overly optimistic, but what I'd like to do really in the few minutes I have is to focus my remarks on the recent developments in Afghanistan and their impact on India, especially on the Kashmir conflict with Pakistan. The Taliban Haqqani control represents a huge loss of power, influence, and presence for India in Afghanistan. And as I will say in my conclusion, has made India more insecure in relation to the Kashmir conflict. The Taliban's facilitation of a hijacked Indian Airlines flight in Kandahar over 20 years ago that was mentioned earlier remains deeply etched in India's public memory. But as Shashank has said, I think the key issue really is the role of the Haqqani network, the most feared terror group affiliated to the Taliban, which carried out the deadliest attack against the Indian embassy in Kabul several years ago. In terms of the Haqqani network particularly, the Indian security establishment considers it to be closely linked to Pakistan's intelligence agency, as well as anti-India jihadi groups present in Afghanistan, including the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. Importantly, India had not previously engaged with the Taliban or the Haqqanis covertly or diplomatically in any significant way. There appears at the moment, from an Indian perspective, considerable confusion over and uncertainty over the intentions and practices of the new Afghan regime towards India prospectively. And this takes place amidst four developments that I'd quickly look at. These are developments which include differences emerging between the Taliban and the Haqqani network towards India, Pakistan's determined and long-standing effort to end India's presence in Afghanistan, concerns over the presence of anti-India terror groups in Afghanistan, and of course the Kashmir conflict. Let's look at the differences that have emerged between the Taliban and the Haqqani perspective towards India. The Taliban leadership, interestingly enough, has in the past few weeks made conciliatory statements towards India, including a desire for friendly cultural and economic relations, the hope that India would continue its development work in Afghanistan. But the powerful Haqqani group has actually taken an opposite approach. The young Haqqani leader, Nas Haqqani, has publicly stated that India's role for the past 20 years in Afghanistan has been negative. And clearly it remains to be seen whether the powerful Haqqani network's views towards India will prevail or not in the next few weeks and months. If we look at Pakistan's perspective, the India-Pakistan tensions had been a key driver for their competition for influence and fierce rivalry in Afghanistan. In Pakistan, therefore, there is now a sense of triumphalism that it has significantly increased its power and influence over Afghanistan and the consequent closure of India's diplomatic missions in Afghanistan. This is the result of strong and long-standing Pakistani intelligence ties with the Taliban and the Haqqani network through funding, arming, training, and the provision of sanctuary in Pakistan. It is likely that the successes that the Taliban have had in Afghanistan would possibly not have taken place if the Pakistani intelligence support had not been there. If we look at the anti-India terror groups, the third I mentioned, according to the UN, the Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed have approximately 800 and 200 armed fighters within Afghanistan, co-located with Taliban forces. Although Taliban leaders, again, as part of the conciliatory message to India, have publicly said that Afghanistan will not be used to host Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed or other anti-India groups, their actions so far undermine their public statements. And this we've seen in two ways. Firstly, in a large number of Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed prisoners escaping the Kabul prison when it was overrun and embedding with the Taliban and the Haqqanis. And secondly, with Sirajul Haqqani, the acting interior minister of Afghanistan today, where Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed have reportedly been deployed for the security of Kabul. And this brings me to the fourth point, which is on Kashmir. In a partially revealing interview to the BBC, Suhail Shaheen, the official spokesman of the Taliban's Qatar office, said the Taliban had a right to raise their voices for Muslims in Kashmir. For the Indian security establishment, again, this is a red flag and appears to indicate that the Taliban is also coming under increasing pressure from Pakistan intelligence to take a strong stand against India in Kashmir. So where does all this leave us in terms of Afghanistan's impact on Kashmir? In effect, India has two major security concerns in relation to Afghanistan, as mentioned by Prime Minister Modi recently: terrorism and radicalization. In terms of terrorism, the Indian security establishment's fears are firstly that once the situation within Afghanistan stabilizes, Afghan-based Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed could host training camps and intensify efforts to plan and implement terror attacks in Kashmir, thereby decreasing footprints to Pakistan, already under scrutiny by the Financial Action Task Force, including logistics support. When the Taliban were last in power, there were a number of Afghan mujahideen who were killed in Kashmir. However, at the moment, the sense is that this is not the primary source of concern emanating for India from Afghanistan. What is more important is the role that Pakistan intelligence could play in the sense of triumphalism that has emerged and the newly established strategic depth that they have against India in terms of Afghanistan that could lead to heightened support for anti-India terror groups. However, my own sense is that there's greater concern in India over the rise and spread of Islamic radicalization from Afghanistan than there is immediately from terror groups in Afghanistan or the Pakistani side. In effect, the Taliban Haqqani regime could encourage Islamic radicalization in a way that the so-called Islamic State in Iraq, Syria was unable to do. This could take the form, for example, of terrorism inspired on ideological grounds through increased radicalization of Kashmiri youth, exacerbated by some of the local tensions we've heard in Kashmir. To conclude, the Taliban Haqqani network in the Taliban Haqqani regime in Afghanistan has made India more insecure in relation to Kashmir. Although they are unlikely to seek to carry out attacks in India, they could be complicit in providing a safe haven to anti-India terror groups as well as encouraging radicalization in India. This would also be exacerbated by Pakistani intelligence and its newly acquired strategic depth against India. Thank you.
Rahul, thank you very much. And what you say just absolutely ties in the title for this session. Troubling times for India, diminishing democracy, the Kashmir conflict, and the effects of Afghanistan. Those three things can't easily now be disaggregated. So we have about 30 minutes for questions. So just to remind you, if you would like to submit a question, if you're watching on your browsers, then please submit a question through the Q&A function. We will read it out if we can't contact you directly. If we can contact you directly, then we will. And if there are questions from our audience here, just indicate in the old-fashioned way. If you put a hand up, then I will come to you, and you will need a microphone if you're speaking here. So if we've got a microphone, we have one question here. Let's take the first one from the audience here, and then we'll go to a question from Amitav Banerjee.
Can I put this question to...
It is on, it's okay.
Can I put this question to Mr. Chowdhury? How do you see the guarantee that the Taliban are giving the US of not having any terrorism on there, or not engendering any terrorism on their territory, being upheld? I mean, how is this guarantee going to be upheld? And in terms of India, the impact of the rising influence of Pakistan, does it mean that India has to then carry on regardless in the game of building bridges, not so much as looking at alignment, but finding areas of convergence where it might still retain influence. Thank you.
Rahul.
Thank you. I think clearly there is a very strong international effort to sort of stay away from any recognition of the Taliban regime unless there are 3 or 4 conditions that are met. One of the conditions clearly is in terms of the sort of jihadi groups that are present in Afghanistan and have links with the Taliban and the Haqqani network, including Al-Qaeda, in Khorasan province, Islamic State in Khorasan province, etc. So I think that the Indian sort of perspective, my sense is that the West will likely get a deal on some of these groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, KP, etc., AQIS. But there is concern that actually the groups that are focused on India may be left out of this sort of engagement. And the question then comes in is that, well, what happens then? Because if recognition is provided eventually to the Taliban regime, and on the basis there'll be no group with safe haven interest in targeting the West, then how does India cope with this situation? And obviously it doesn't have the leverages in that sense that in Afghanistan that it had earlier. Pakistan does have the leverages in relation to the groups Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, which it doesn't for the other groups facing the West. So it's a complicated situation. But I think the sense really will be as to see whether there is any sort of movement of these groups outside Afghanistan, whether they are whether their numbers increase, whether training camps are set up in some of the areas where they are, which would provide a sort of a sense of what the next steps could be. In terms of convergence of issues, I think, interestingly, the rivalry that India and Pakistan had over Afghanistan has ended because it's very clear India has withdrawn its personnel. Of course, Indian sort of the soft power can't be eroded in Afghanistan, but at the same time, the stakes for India have gone down. And Pakistan, I think, is in a better position to take a call as to what it wants to do in the future. But what we are seeing emerging, unlike the past, where India was left out of most of the sort of mini-laterals of the peace process of engaging with the Taliban before 15th August, when the Taliban took over Kabul, what we're seeing is that India is engaging more diplomatically. So tomorrow, Indian officials will be represented in Moscow at a meeting that is being held with the acting deputy prime minister of the Taliban, which will be the second senior engagement that India would have with the Taliban regime. The Indian National Security Advisor has called for a meeting of national security advisors from the region next month to talk about Afghanistan. So I think your point is extremely important, that actually, though India finds itself in a difficult space at the moment, especially where Pakistan and Afghanistan, there could still be an opportunity for engagement. And the importance of actually ensuring that Pakistan also has concerns. The TTP in Afghanistan could easily also move against Pakistan if the peace process doesn't move through. So these organizations, whether they're anti-Western, anti-India, anti-Pakistan in Afghanistan, really are a common concern for the region. And the region needs to work together to ensure that there are guarantees in place to prevent terror attacks emanating from Afghanistan.
Thank you, Rahul. Yeah, paradoxically, the grim nature of the situation has actually created some diplomatic elbow room within the region, which is a silver lining to it. Okay, let's take a question from one of our audience outside this room. So this is from Anitav Banerjee. And Amitav asks, the Quad that we were speaking about a little while ago is aimed primarily at containing China, but does India expect, by participating in the Quad, that the US will also be more understanding and supportive of the Indian position vis-à-vis Pakistan. So is there a good diplomatic reason for India to be involved in the Quad? Shashank, could I just get a comment from you on that?
Sure. I mean, first of all, let me say I don't disagree that the Quad is aimed at containing Chinese power, but that sort of implies a Kennan sort of containment philosophy, whereas I think the early efforts of the Quad are more about trying to present an attractive alternative to the reality of Chinese power, whether that is development funding or whether that is alternative to 5G networks or resilient supply chains and more, as I mentioned, vaccines provision for Southeast Asia, where you have, Indian delivery and manufacturing, American and Australian finance, and so on and so forth. So I just want to sort of issue a sort of my view of that. This is interesting because for a long time, of course, there were voices in India that were frustrated at American support for Pakistan, India's principal, the thorn in its side, over many years. But in a way, the question is sort of belated because what we see now is that the US-Pakistan relationship is in tatters. It's in just utterly broken shape for a host of reasons. But look, you have a spectre of a Pakistani national security advisor today who is going around giving media interviews where he's publicly lamenting the fact that Joe Biden isn't calling Imran Khan. It's bordering on desperation. And the fact that they are saying it publicly, so vocally, shows the depth of their frustration and the degrees to which this administration in Washington is willing to practically humiliate Prime Minister Khan. Why is that? Well, there's accumulated grievances of 15 years in Afghanistan where there was a sense that Pakistani support for the Taliban contributed to America's defeat. You have a generation of diplomats, including those who served in the Obama-Biden administration and now are in positions of power, who remember all of that and are not inclined to give Pakistan the time of day. But more tangibly, Pakistan's leverage has diminished. Pakistan was a vital and unavoidable logistical hub for the Afghan war. It was a hub for fuel, ammunition, supplies, troops through Karachi and through the passes into Afghanistan. That's gone. And that loss of dependence gives the US far less reason to play nice with Pakistan. Now, of course, counterterrorism is the enduring problem. And as we saw, when you don't have good intelligence on the ground in Afghanistan, what you get is, and you still attempt over-the-horizon counterterrorism via remote strikes, what you can have is calamities like the one we saw after the Kabul airport bombing, in which civilians were killed by American strikes. So Pakistani intelligence on the ground is still going to be important. That's still going to connect the US and Pakistan. But that relationship, I suspect, we're seeing a rupture in front of our eyes, and I don't see that being healed anytime soon.
Thank you. Sumantra, yes. What can India get out of the Quad?
I think the answer to the question as it was phrased is basically yes. India has expectations in return for its participation in the Quad. I've written in the book that the geopolitics of the contemporary 21st century Kashmir conflict is basically quadrilateral. It involves, in addition to the principles, India and Pakistan, China, as well as the United States. China more looming in the foreground these days, but the United States is very much also there in the background. I completely agree with Shashank that the Doklam crisis in the summer of 2017 was a turning point in Sino-Indian relations. And the trijunction of India, Bhutan, and Tibet, that is China, what happened there in the summer of 2017. And I don't think it's entirely a coincidence that that was also the year in which the Quad concept was revived. It had gone into something of a stupor since it was first mooted by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan in 2007, 10 years earlier. Going back a little to the Kashmir conflict, I think the dynamic duo of Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah in New Delhi had very much factored in the likely Pakistani response to their new Kashmir policy, which was inaugurated in August 2019. And they had rightly figured, calculated that Pakistan, would huff and puff, rave and rant, which is exactly what happened, but would not be able to do anything very much, at least not immediately. And that's exactly, what happened. What would Pakistan do? Start another war with India, or escalate, sub-conventional warfare using jihadists? That's also wasn't very much a viable option 2 years ago, at least, although it may change now. One never knows, or slowly change. But the Modi-Shah duo did not, well, it wasn't a viable option because of the Fatah issue and also the blowback in Pakistan against the patronage of jihadist groups for 3 decades now by the Pakistani deep state. But I believe that the Modi-Shah duo did not adequately factor in the Chinese response and did not realize how harsh and hostile it would be, and that the Chinese would perhaps use this as a pretext to escalate its adversarial posturing, vis-a-vis India, although it's impossible to read, Xi Jinping's mind. Now, about the Biden administration, it's made it clear that its overwhelming, overriding strategic priority is to contain China, and the Quad is one of the pillars of that. Now, this is my last point. The Biden administration, I think it's reasonable to say, is not very comfortable with the nature of the Modi government, including its Kashmir policy since August 2019. But when faced with the choice of China flexing its military muscles on the Ladakh frontier and human rights issues in Kashmir, which side will the Biden administration choose? Well, if you want me to take a guess, they will go with the strategic alignment with India rather than with human rights concerns in Kashmir.
Thank you. Okay, now here's a humdinger that's coming in the way of Mukulika. All right, so this is a question from John Dobson, the journalist. And he says, I have a weekly geopolitical column in the Indian Sunday Guardian. Given the external pressures on India from China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, does the panel not agree that Indian citizens feel safer with a strong populist leader such as Modi and are not particularly concerned with the current lack of purity in their democracy? So, Mukulika. I'll ask the others, you may all want to comment, but this is straight in your direction.
Thank you. I think the lack of purity in democracy has been stated tongue firmly in cheek there. I don't think it's the problem with the lack of purity. There isn't a pure democracy anywhere. I think all democracies are faulty versions of what we think a democracy should be, or it's a work in progress. And some do better than others at various points in their history. I think India has done remarkably well, given in 1947 the whole world thought India was too poor and too illiterate to have universal suffrage and have a full-fledged representative democracy. India has proved all those naysayers wrong. So India has something to say for its own record on democracy. This is not other people judging it. I think it's India judging herself by her own standards of democracy, number one. Number two, I don't think people are concerned. The big problems in India at the moment for your average Indian is not what is happening on its borders. It is the severe agrarian distress. It is the huge unemployment problem. Mr. Modi was, of course, elected in 2014 on a development agenda. This is a young country. 50% of the population is under the age of 30. You need to create 1 million jobs a month to deal with the demand. And that was why people wanted Mr. Modi in charge. I mean, that was what was promised. So the purity of democracy is not the problem. It is the severe agrarian distress, the threat of the new farm laws, which farmers believe are against their interests. And India is, you said, we don't think about rural India. Precisely, 60% of India lives in villages. It's a rural and largely agrarian country still. This is a problem. Youth unemployment is a problem. You know, in 2002, Kargil was, right? When a very 99. Interesting, sorry, 99. When the Kargil conflict happened, a survey was done. It was in the headlines. It dominated, of course, journalists writing about India the world over and in India. But a survey was done amongst Indians across the country about the Kargil war. And 90% of people hadn't heard of the conflict. That world has changed, of course. Media is different. But I think the media also is very, if anything, people are also aware of the loss of territory, of China's presence on Indian territory and the complete inability. I think my co-panelists who do this stuff more seriously have remarked on this already, that beyond a point there is nothing India can do about China on Indian soil and how it's managed. So even on foreign policy there are issues, but the real issues are the hike in petrol prices, the backsliding of the economy, the need for jobs, the flash floods all over India. There is a real problem with climate change going on right in front of our eyes, where, for instance, the flash floods in Kerala, God's own country, where many people visit from abroad. The flash floods that are going on in Kerala at the moment, as we speak, are directly the result of the violation of a number of environmental measures that have been advocated for decades and which India has failed to deal with. So these are the real problems, in a sense.
Can I add?
Okay. Yes. Any other comments? Shashank,
Sort of almost adding a,
okay.
directing
I'll give each of you a quick comment on that. Go on.
Well, is it also the case that the Modi government has succeeded in creating a narrative of progress, particularly attractive to aspirational, upwardly mobile middle classes and to low middle classes, irrespective of those crises, that's able to sort of work in parallel and separate to those development power crises, that looks to the future, looks beyond those, and that has an enduring message and appeal that's almost unhinged and detached from specific economic indicators or things like that. A sense of optimism that we see in a number of sort of populist leaders.
I don't think that it is aspirational middle-class India. I think it is an upper-caste urban India that it's a majoritarian agenda, that the Hindus are the majority population in India and they've got behind it, but it's a very upper-caste agenda. As research has been showing, Dalits, violence against Dalits, the ex-untouchable, the lowest in the caste hierarchy, has risen exponentially in the last few years. So it is anyone who is insecure in livelihoods it does not subscribe to that aspirational vision, which of course we want to subscribe to. I think everybody would like to subscribe to, but there is no room for it.
Okay, Sumantra.
The Modi government's narrative of progress is too hollow to be sustainable, and I expect it will largely unravel over the next year or two. But the next Indian general election is still 2.5 years away. The second Modi government is exactly halfway through its term. And in 2 years' time, in the countdown to that make or break election for India's democracy, I suspect, looking into the future a bit, that Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah will play the national security card with a vengeance. Now, whether that will work or not and compensate for the weakness of the development and progress narrative remains to be seen. It's an open question. However, of course, as I've already said, the national security card, when it is played with a vengeance, will probably have something to do with Kashmir. However, as I've said, I fear there may be a major escalation relating to Kashmir, somehow linked to Kashmir, significantly before that.
Okay, Rahul.
I think clearly Prime Minister Modi won the last general elections in 2019 on a national security basis. The Balakot strike that took place when India targeted mainland Pakistan for the first time. So I think clearly, that was their national security was a key. I'm not sure I agree with Sumantra that this, we'll sort of have a replay of what we saw in 2019 and 2024, because the cards that he can actually use are limited. It's not going to be the China factor because India is in a much relatively weaker position on the border with China. The Pakistan card again, the Kashmir card, well, we'll have to wait and see. But I think that it's going to be more difficult to really focus on the national security aspect. The key question for me actually is, well, today, who is best placed to win the next elections in 2024? And it still is Prime Minister Modi and the BJP. Unless that changes, unless the lead opposition party in India, the Congress party, are able to get a leader, etc., Modi has certain advantages which he's going to use as he goes into 2024.
Okay, we want to move on, but Mukulika, one final note.
It's okay, we can move on.
No, go on, say it, you're allowed.
It was very interesting. There's a young man who worked with the BJP and part of political analysis as has emerged as a profession in India. I wrote a book called How to Win an Election. And, in response to what Rahul and Shashank have just said, that one of the things he observes from working inside the BJP, for instance, Shiv Shankar Singh, this guy's name is that if you win an election on a development manifesto, then the next election can't be a development manifesto because it's a report card. People ask you what you've done. So you have to shift the narrative to something else. And as Rahul said, it was Balakot. On the same logic, you wonder, you may be right that 2024 can't again be on the same thing. It would have to be something else, but we don't know what. And today it's very interesting that in the Indian press, the writing is that we are not thinking about 2024, we are thinking about 2022, next year, when the biggest state in India goes to the polls, Uttar Pradesh, which determines what's going to happen in the national election. So actually the scenario is even more immediate.
Okay, let's just go to our audience for questions. Sir.
Martin Raven, ex-Foreign Office. You mentioned the question of geopolitics. Does the nuclear issue feature in any of that? Where does that imply any relationship between India, Pakistan, and the whole possibility of nuclear proliferation?
Yeah, Rahul, you're the man on nuclear.
I think clearly both countries, India and Pakistan, have a rivalry. They've had conflict. They have nuclear weapons. The numbers are increasing. The modes of delivery are becoming more sophisticated on both sides. They're not talking to each other also diplomatically. In fact, the last meeting of the two officials talking about nuclear issues, I think, took place 7-8 years ago. So inherently, the situation is unstable on the nuclear front. But having said that, there still hasn't been any crisis that we've really had on this issue since 2001, when there were concerns of the escalation of the tensions, the conflict between India and Pakistan to a nuclear level. So in a way, this is there. It's not going away. And one important element that the IISS we've always we've argued about is that there needs to be engagement between the nuclear commanders of India and Pakistan to talk to each other to stabilize further the situation, irrelevant whether there are official talks between India and Pakistan. But we haven't yet had much success on that.
Okay, we want to move on, so we will be brisk, but Shashank.
Firstly, I think there was a little bit of nuclear signalling visible during the Balakot crisis. We saw Pakistani claims of that, and we saw Prime Minister Modi himself talk about nuclear weapons subsequently. But setting that aside, I think the one worry is that nuclear weapons, certainly on the Indian side, are becoming more accurate. Accuracy is improving. Means of surveillance are improving with satellites and synthetic aperture radar satellites and all of these things. There is concern, certainly on the Pakistani side, that this makes it easier for India to target Pakistan's nuclear forces. Whether that is correct or whether that's a misperception of Indian intentions and capabilities is almost besides the point. The technology is taking us into new areas that pose new problems and risks.
Okay, we'll try and get two more questions in, one in the room and one on screen. So, gentlemen here. Sir.
Thank you very much. Do opposition parties pose allies or opponents to India's more pronounced and prominent geopolitical position? Do they have buy-in to the new relationships that have developed over the last 5 to 7 years?
Good point. Sumantra, the opposition parties, do they buy into India's global emergence to the strategic responsibilities India seems now to want to take on?
I think in India, in the last 7 years, since the first Modi government took office, everything, including every achievement or advance, has been highly personalized. It's Modi's achievement. It's to his credit. And when anything goes wrong, he just goes silent. For example, during the devastating second wave of COVID-19, which is just about 5 or 6 months ago. When you have a personalized, quasi-autocrat in power, I think it's really too much to expect opposition parties to have a role in foreign policy. It's nobody in India expects this anymore. It's all about Modi. I think that's my best shot at an answer.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take one final question. I'll ask each of our panelists in turn to have a go at this. This is the question I wanted to ask, really. This comes from Ravi Kandamath, who says, what stops Western leaders raising India's falling democratic standards with PM Modi? Why didn't we do it? This shouldn't affect the West's and India's security concerns about any legitimate responses to the Taliban Haqqani regime in Afghanistan. So why don't we put strategic relations on one side and just raise the questions that we have about democratic standards? So let's ask each of our panelists. Go on then, Sumantra, you start.
I don't necessarily have to be first, but anyway, I'll do it. I think they do raise it, but gently, mildly, perhaps obliquely, keeping sensitivities in mind. For example, I think when Blinken, the Secretary of State, visited India fairly recently, he did raise this, perhaps mildly, gently, even obliquely, but he did raise it. And such gentle, mild, and possibly oblique kind of references are easily kind of staved off. And I think the response of S. Jaishankar, who is the Modi government's foreign minister, was that there is room for improvement in all democracies, which I thought was a brilliant rejoinder, whether one agrees with it or not. Now, look, there are the U.S. and India have certain common concerns. For example, the Haqqani network, which has emerged, we've heard already, as vastly influential in the new order in Afghanistan. In July 2008, there was a massive suicide bombing of the Indian embassy in Kabul. And according to US intelligence, that was carried out by the Haqqani network with the support of the ISI. You get my point. And of course, a few months later, Lashkar-e-Taiba struck in Mumbai, again with probable ISI collusion, at least of elements of the ISI. So I think at the end of the day, rather than these normative issues, it's security issues, especially relating to terrorism, that are decisive.
Got it. Thank you, Mukulika.
Thank you. I think India has got to the point where, why should it take lessons on democracy from Western leaders? There is that very sense. India has its own experience of democracy for over 70 years. It knows how to do it. So there is a sense, I think, which Western leaders no doubt are also aware, that their own democracies need repair. And so there is no moral policing on the democratic norm as they may have been in the past. The problem is, of course, that there are varieties of backsliding, and as I was trying to indicate, that there are some things that imagine in Britain, where I know there are concerns about democracy backsliding here, but there are degrees to it. Would the Prime Minister of Britain not addressing a press conference for 7 years be acceptable in Britain? There are degrees of how bad it can be. But at the end of the day, the best policemen for this really are Indian citizens. They should be holding them to account rather than Western governments. It is evident that common strategic interests mean that it is important to have an alliance of notional democracies, right? And if that democracy is flawed, well, we'll just look the other way.
We all suffer.
Yeah.
Okay, 30 seconds each.
It's very simple. They don't think it would make much difference. B, they need India's cooperation. And as I said in my opening remarks, India feels it is in a sought-after position geopolitically. And so people are wary. You can't separate the strategic and the ideological in that way. As any diplomat understands and knows, they're intertwined, and people are afraid of a prickly reaction that will compromise their broader bilateral ties.
Good point. Rahul.
I think India and Prime Minister Modi is sensitive to criticism of India's human rights issues. It's not immune to the criticism. India has been recently re-elected to the UN Human Rights Council, and obviously in the media in India is sort of very supportive of this. But the point here is that Western leaders have taken a call, and the call is that India's rising economy, its profile, the requirement to engage with India, post-Brexit, global Britain, where India is one of the key players for the UK, mean essentially that Western democracies and Western governments are equally sensitive in raising some of these issues or raising it in different fora. So I think, in a way, that this also plays into India's hands, and that is that, well, let's do business, let's talk about geostrategy, let's not really hear about human rights issues from anyone else. And that works well for the Modi government.
Okay, thank you very much. We must leave it there. The next GSF meeting is on the 16th of November, Tuesday the 16th of November, where myself and Helen Ramskar, my co-author, will be launching our latest book called Britain's Persuaders, Soft Power in a Hard World. So it's about Britain's soft power. You'll get some notifications about that in about a week's time. That, I think, will also be a hybrid event. That's the 16th of November. But for now, on your behalf, let me thank Professor Mukulika Banerjee, Professor Sumantra Bose, Shashank Joshi, and Rahul Roy Chowdhury for an extremely useful discussion on India's troubling times. That's it from the GSF from this afternoon. Goodbye.